This story is very tragic, very upsetting, because what happened to the young black man in this video didn't have to happen. There was no reason for it, except injustice. The fact that he was black meant that he was deserving of one thing: brutality, that his life didn't matter. This is the final video in the series I've been doing on When the Law Leaves Us. And if you've been with me on this journey, you know what we've seen. You saw Pink Barber, a black man rushed from arrest to execution in just 81 days by a courtroom that looked like the law but worked like a mob. You heard the name Hattie McRae, a 14-year-old black girl who said no to a white officer's advances and paid for it with her life. You learned about the DeLaGaulle family, where black self-defense was called insurrection, and protecting your own was punished like a capital crime. Each of those stories showed us something about how the law didn't just abandon us, how it organized against black people. But this story is quieter and more brutal, more horrific. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because in this story, the law didn't just fail, it vanished, like it was never there. Before I get into what happened, I need to set the scene for you. I have to give you some history first, because this story takes us to the part of the country that many don't associate with racial violence. You've heard me talk about a lot of injustice against black people in the South. But what we experienced in Alabama, we experienced in Illinois. What we experienced in Mississippi, we experienced in Montana. What we experienced in Georgia, we experienced in Kansas and in Indiana. This violence was never just a Southern phenomenon. It was a national pattern. And in the so-called heartland, the Midwest and the Great Plains and even the Mountain West, communities used mob violence, expulsion, and legal silence to enforce racial boundaries. The location was different, but the intent and the method and the purpose behind it was the same. And that was injustice against black people. Take Kansas, for example. In 1901, a black veteran in labor was lynched in Leavenworth after being accused of attacking a white woman. His trial never came. The mob burned him alive in front of thousands. Indiana, widely seen as a Midwestern model of order, had 66 recorded lynchings. One of the most infamous came in 1930, when a white mob in Marion broke into the jail, dragged two black teenagers from their cells, and lynched them in the town square. The photos were turned into postcards. Not one person was ever convicted. In Utah, a black coal miner was lynched in 1925 by a mob of white men in Carbon County. His body was paraded through the streets. The Salt Lake Tribune called it justice. In Maine, as far from the South as one could go, a black man was lynched in 1873. And in Delaware, a black man named George Wright was burned alive in front of thousands in 1903, while the governor looked on. And in the Midwest, especially in towns across Illinois, and Ohio, and Indiana, whiteness was enforced not just through the law, but through sundown customs. Towns where black people were warned to leave by nightfall. Towns where the signs didn't need to be posted because the threats were understood. Some towns drove out black residents entirely. None of these places were Southern, but the violence looked the same. The brutality and black suffering was just the same. And so was the silence that followed. And that brings us to Ohio. Ohio had a reputation for abolition, but it also had a record of lynching. Mobs lynched black men across the state in towns like Ironton, Springfield, and Urbana. And by the early 20th century, black communities across Ohio had learned what was expected. Stay in your place. Don't stay overnight. Don't get too close. Otherwise, you might lose your life. And that's what happened to the young black man I'm going to tell you about for the rest of this video. Luke Mer was born sometime around 1908 in Macon, Georgia. He came from a well-respected black family, hardworking and proud. And in a time when opportunities were few for black people, Luke did something remarkable. He graduated from high school. That alone was a triumph, because in 1920s Georgia, education for black children was not just segregated. We were deliberately locked out from educational advancement because of the color of our skin. Our schools were not schools at all. They were underfunded, under-resourced shacks that reinforced our social status every day, on the bottom rail of society. The system told us that we belonged in fields, not in classrooms. But Luke pushed through. Sometime later, he met a young woman named Alberta Emery, also from the Macon area. They fell in love and got married around 1929. Luke was 21 and Alberta was 18. That same year, they welcomed their first and only child together, a baby girl named Doris Louise. We don't know exactly how or why, but at some point, Luke and Alberta made their way to Atlanta. It was there that Luke began working as a chauffeur for a man named Howard Davidson. The Davidsons were a wealthy and powerful white family originally from South Point, Ohio. Howard had relocated his household to Atlanta in 1921, where he rose to become the vice president of the Southern Tobacco Company. Luke worked for the Davidson family for 6 years, and by all accounts, he grew close to them. He was well liked by them, trusted, and it was that trust and that connection to a prominent white family that would eventually lead him to South Point, Ohio. Sometime in early 1932, one of Howard Davidson's relatives died in South Point, Ohio, leaving behind a large farm and estate. Howard was named the executor and needed to return home to settle the affairs. So he packed up his family, his wife Clyde and their niece Nancy Adams, and headed back to South Point. But they didn't go alone. They brought their trusted chauffeur with them, 24-year-old Luke Mer. Remember, Luke went everywhere with his family. He was the driver, so it was only natural for them to bring him along. So Luke said goodbye to his wife Alberta and their daughter Doris, and drove the Davidsons family back to Ohio. The plan was for him just to be gone for a few months, help them get settled, manage the estate, and then come back home. But Luke didn't know when he said goodbye, it would be the last time he ever saw them. South Point was in Lawrence County, Ohio, a small town tucked into the southernmost tip of the state. In 1930, Lawrence County had a population of about 44,000 people, working primarily in agriculture, in mining, and manufacturing. Less than 4% of the county was black. Now, I can imagine that Luke had heard and might have personally seen and witnessed the horrors that black people experienced in his home state of Georgia. Between 1880 and 1930, 439 black people were lynched in Georgia. Actually, in 1930, Georgia led the country in lynchings. So Luke would have been familiar with the brutality that black people faced there. But what he wouldn't have been ready for was the equally intense racial hatred he'd faced in Ohio. Ohio was colder than Georgia, but that's where the differences ended. Because when it came to how black people were treated, the temperature of injustice was just as high. When Luke got to South Point with the Davidsons, he continued doing what he had always done with them, driving them around, running errands, going everywhere with them. But that caused problems in this Sundown town. South Point wasn't used to seeing a black man move that freely, not just through the streets, but in close company with a wealthy white family. Luke's warm and visible relationship with the Davidsons made people uncomfortable, angry even, because what they were doing together, the ease and the trust and the familiarity, it transgressed the racial norms that kept the cycle of injustice running smoothly there. The unspoken order that told black people where they could be, how they could act, and how far they were allowed to go was being violated by the Davidsons. And the town didn't stay silent about it. They let the family know. People talked. People warned. If I could pause here for just 1 second, because I found this part of the story very interesting. Because normally it's the other way around. The story we've often heard is about a black person from the north going south. A black person who thinks too highly of themselves, too proud, too free, and it leads to a deadly ending. Or we've heard about a northern white person who fails to respect the racial customs of the South and ends up being ostracized by other white people for stepping out of line. But here we have something very different. This time the movement was reversed. A southern black man went north, and the outcome was just the same. I highlight this for one reason, to make something very clear. There was no place a black person could go and escape injustice. The South, the North, the Midwest, the East Coast, the West Coast, the Great Plains. It did not matter. If you were black, injustice was going to find you and come for you. Racism was always looking for you. Brutality was always lurking around the corner. Jim Crow was everywhere, at all times. And Luke was about to find that out. In Ohio, Luke lived in the Davidsons' home, not in the servants' quarter. And he was in charge of the house while Howard Davidson was gone. Luke was trusted and needed. But that trust and that need sparked jealousy. And when racism is involved, jealousy just doesn't remain in the same place. It turns, it spreads, and eventually it leads to violence against a black person. South Point had a number of illiterate and impoverished white residents. Many of them were not as well off as the Davidsons. And Luke's proximity to their wealth, to that status, meant that he was better off than some of the poorest white people in that town. And that that could not stand. It was like a slap in the face. They knew they were poor, but knowing that a black person was beneath them gave them the kind of control and comfort. At least we aren't black. At least we're still over them. That's what Jim Crow offered. Not opportunity, but a false sense of superiority. That kind that lets you go to bed at night thinking, I'm better. I'm poor, but I'm still better than them. No wealth to pass down, but better. Bad health outcomes, but better. I'm still better than them. That was the lie. That being white was its own reward. That no matter how little you had, at least you had that. And Jim Crow made sure they clung to it, even when it cost them too. But not with Luke and the Davidsons. He exposed that lie. The lie that black meant second class, that black meant downcast. His presence disrupted the story they needed to believe, because that's how Jim Crow kept poor white people in his camp, with a promise, a lie dressed up like a bargain. Stick with me, and I'll make sure that they stay beneath you. Now, to be clear, it wasn't just that Luke was close with the Davidsons. It wasn't just that they saw him driving them around in their nice car. No, that was part of it, but that was not the thing that really set them off. What enraged the locals was the lie that always enraged them. Proximity to a white woman. The old lie. The one that never needed proof. The one that said that black men were always wanting, always lurking, and always trying to attack white women. When Howard and his wife Clyde weren't around, Luke served as their niece Nancy's driver and chaperone. He was the one responsible for taking her around town, the one tasked with protecting her. But not just from anyone, from the white men in town who wanted to pursue her, to get close to her, to court her. Now, make sure you heard what I said. Luke was stopping white men from getting access to a white woman. He was her protector. And that was the last straw. It was bad enough that he was living, eating, and driving better than them. But this, they could not tolerate it. Luke was warned to stay away from Nancy, and not by the Davidsons, but by the white men in that town. From here, the story takes the turn that it always took when this mixture came together. Racism mixed with grievances, mixed with false beliefs about attacks on white womanhood. The result was always the same: injustice and horrific brutality on a black person. After this, the presence of mob rule and the absence of the law that Luke knew from Georgia, the way of life of black people in the South, was about to show up in Ohio. June 7, 1932, was a day that set everything in motion. The day that began the end of Luke Mer. Remember, Luke had been getting harassed by locals for pretty much everything. June 7th is when they made their move. Some sort of altercation occurred between Luke and a young white man named Ben Hall and a group of his friends. We don't know exactly what was said or who did what, but Ben Hall claimed that Luke pulled a knife on him. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. Maybe Luke did do it to protect himself from another unprovoked attack. Or maybe he didn't do it at all, and it was made up from the start. Don't focus on that so much, because it's not important. It's not important because there is nothing Luke could have done that would justify what was about to happen next, what they did to him. Luke wanted to get out of there and avoid the confrontation. So he left and went back to the Davidsons' farm. But that was no escape, because Ben Hall and the others followed him there, still harassing Luke, still threatening him, still not letting up. They claimed Luke pulled his knife again, that this time he grabbed Ben's brother, James Hall, and threatened to cut his throat. They also said that Luke wasn't just violent, that he was drunk. But Mrs. Davidson would later say that she never saw Luke drunk ever, not once, that was a lie. Whatever the truth was about these two confrontations, what happened next is certain. Someone called the South Point town marshal, a man named Rip Winters. He came and arrested both Luke and Ben and took them both to jail. As they were being taken away, one of the young white men who was with Ben Hall said out loud that they were going to get that SOB, referring to Luke. Once they arrived at the jail, Marshal Winters began carrying out the next part of the plan, because he wasn't just taking Luke to jail for safekeeping. And it wasn't because Luke had committed some real crime. No. What he did was carry out a plan that had clearly been worked out before this moment ever happened. Instead of locking Luke up in a secure cell, Marshal Winters removed him and placed him in an open vestibule in the jail. He then left the door unlocked, walked out, and went home for dinner. telling people he'd be back in 2 hours. As soon as he left, the mob rated themselves. They knew their job. They knew what they were supposed to do. But as I was learning about this story and reading it, I wondered about Luke. Did he know? Did he have any idea what was about to happen to him? In the Jim Crow South, you heard the stories. Stories of mobs storming jails, kidnapping black men, and lynching them. So maybe if this had been a rural jail in Georgia, Luke might have seen it coming. He might have known that something bad was about to happen. But this wasn't rural Georgia. This was rural Ohio. And we also have to remember this. Luke hadn't been accused of anything that mobs usually use to justify their brutality. No one said he had done anything wrong to Nancy, other than being seen with her. Luke might have thought that Howard Davidson would sort all of this out. This would all blow over, that he'd be out of there soon. After all, he wasn't in Georgia, and he wasn't alone. He worked for a powerful, white, wealthy family. He lived in their house. He was trusted, invisible, and protected. At least, that's what it must have felt like. So, it's very possible that when Marshall Winters left him sitting in the jail, Luke had no idea what was coming, that his life was in danger. Once Marshall Winters was gone, the mob moved in. At least 14 white men stormed the jail, shouting, "Get ready in there. Here we come." If Luke didn't know what was about to happen before, he knew when he saw those men, filled with anger and hatred coming for him. They snatched him quickly and took him out of the jail to a waiting car. One of the mob members would later say that Luke thought that they were coming just to give him a beating. Supposedly, Luke said that he would take the beating, but he just didn't want to be cut. Whether that's true or not, we will never know. But what happened next, we do know. Not from testimony, but from the evidence. From what they left of Luke's body. Luke's body was discovered 3 days later, floating in the Ohio River, near the town of Ironton. It was beginning to decompose, and what was left of him showed the truth, that he had sustained a severe beating. His neck had been broken. There were marks consistent with a rope being around his neck. Luke had been lynched. He was just a 24-year-old young black man who did his job. That's all. Luke didn't hurt anyone. He literally did nothing, except be black and exist in South Point, Ohio in 1932. And that was his crime. That was his trial. That was his sentence. And that was his execution. His blackness convicted him, and his blackness justified his penalty. When I tell these stories, my mind can't help but to go to those last moments. The moments when you know you're not going to make it out of this alive. When you see the rage-filled hatred in the eyes of your attackers as they joyfully inflict pain on you. The moments when you see the rope, when you feel the pressure, when you know you're just moments away. When you feel fear, pain, and sorrow and sadness all at the same time. What went through Luke's mind? Was it his wife, Alberta? How he'd never see her again? Never hold her? Never kiss her? Never get the chance to grow old together? Or was it his daughter, Doris? How he'd never get to experience those precious moments with her? Never get to teach her, love her, guide her? Never get to celebrate her birthdays? Hold her when she cried? Cheer her on when she succeeded? Never get to see her get married? Never get to say, "Daddy's proud of you. Daddy loves you." I think about those moments because that's when you realize what racism and injustice really did to black people. It stole. It stole your present and your future. It stole your hopes and your dreams. It took everything from you and from those who loved you. Jim Crow was a thief, but he didn't act alone. He had help from towns, from officials, from courts, from men with power and men with badges. And that's where we go next in this story. If you remember, Marshall Winters had gone home, and he said that he'd be back in 2 hours. Well, when he returned, he just so happened not to remember that Luke was in his custody. He claimed he didn't even notice that Luke was missing, and he told no one. Not a single person was notified that a black man had disappeared from that jail without explanation. That's because the plan was for no one to know. No report, no search, no questions. Just silence. In fact, no one had any idea what happened to Luke. Not until his body was found Friday afternoon floating in the river. Once Luke's body was found, the truth had been uncovered. But That's also when the lie started. Because just like in the South, lynching had to be justified. The black man had to be made to look to be dangerous, deserving, as if death wasn't violence, but consequence. Some in South Point tried to dirty Luke's name, tried to portray him as a predator, a black man on the hunt for white women. Because that's how lynching worked. You didn't just take the life, you stained the name. You made sure that the violence looked like justice, so no one would question what had really been done. A woman named Luke Hall, a relative of Ben and James Hall, claimed that Luke had threatened to tear her clothes off. She said he frightened her so badly that she burst into tears and ran away from him. But the reasons they gave to explain away the lynching were a lot more complicated than the truth. The truth was simple. Luke was black, and the people in South Point feared black people, hated black people. And by lynching Luke, they could reassert the rules, restore their town's reputation as a sundown town, a place where black people were not welcome, and better think twice before stepping foot there. Luke's lynching was a message and a warning. He was also lynched because of his relationship with the Davidsons. Seeing Luke ride through town, confident, invisible, and secure, was an affront to the racial order that they depended on to justify their way of life. The trust that Howard Davidson placed in Luke wasn't just unusual, it was intolerable. And finally, as we've already talked about, it was Nancy. Seeing her ride with Luke, seeing them smile, seeing them carry on, to them, there was only one way to deal with that, and that was violence. To end Luke's life immediately. After Luke's body was discovered, black leaders in Ohio sprang into action. Black people were outraged that a black man had been lynched simply for doing his job. The Lincoln Club, which is a black political organization, immediately called a meeting to investigate what happened. The local NAACP also got involved. They presented a petition signed by 300 black residents demanding that Luke's body be exhumed so a full examination could be conducted. Luke had been buried quickly after being pulled from the river before anyone could determine the true extent of his injuries and what had been done to him. They also demanded that the county's chief prosecutor be aided by a white attorney of their choosing, someone the black community could trust. 11 days after Luke's body was found, County Prosecutor Lee Andrews finally got around to questioning 6 white men who were part of the mob. It wasn't like it was a secret who did it. There was just no urgency to do anything about Luke's lynching. The men were 24-year-old Taylor Napier, 29-year-old Theodore Johnson, 24-year-old Mildred Massey, 20-year-old Lawrence Massey, 20-year-old Clyde Elkins, and 16-year-old Lewis McKee. When the prosecutor spoke to them, they didn't even deny their involvement. They all admitted they stormed the jail and kidnapped Luke. 9 days later, a grand jury was convened, and the 6 men were indicted. But justice was still far off, because an indictment didn't mean accountability. It didn't mean conviction. It just meant that someone had been indicted, and that was all. A jury of the men's peers still had to convict them, and that would be a much taller order. The teenager, Lewis McKee, he was sent to a juvenile detention center for his involvement in the lynching. The men went to trial a month later, at the end of July 1932. But by that time, the charges against them had already been downgraded to second-degree taking of a life. And it should come as no surprise that the jury was all male and all white. There was great excitement around the trial. People were waiting at the courthouse as early as 6 a.m. to secure a seat inside the courtroom. Many even brought their own lunch, just so they wouldn't have to give up their seat during the noon recess. All of this excitement over the death of an innocent black man, a man who lost his life for nothing. County Solicitor Lee Andrews prosecuted the case for the state, along with the attorney requested by the Lincoln Club, attorney E.L. Riley. The 6 men were represented by attorney James Collier, who had previously served as the county's prosecutor. In his opening statement, Collier painted a picture of the men as 6 ordinary country boys with a clean record. He said they were not hoodlums, not gangsters. The implication was clear, that they were the good ones, and Luke was not. Collier also used the moment to turn the trial into a referendum on black civil rights activists, the ones who had dared to bring attention to Ironton. He told the jury that he wouldn't yell and carry on like the black activists, but would simply discuss the evidence. Even though Luke was the one who lost his life in a brutal fashion, even though the men he represented were the ones on trial, the defense in Ohio was the same as it had always been in Dixie. Put the black victim on trial. Put the black community on trial. Argued that he deserved it, and that they were making too much noise, and tell the all-white jury the only way to put a stop to all of this is to acquit these 6 white men. When the Davidsons testified, the defense took the opportunity to play on the local resentments towards the wealthy family. They implied that the Davidsons had a perverse relationship with Luke, who they referred to as a low-life Southern Negro. When Clyde Davidson took the stand, she testified that Luke did not have a head wound on his head the last time she saw him. In response, the defense then challenged the facts. Instead, they suggested the only way she would know is that she had a very intimate relationship with Luke, that she touched him often. When Nancy testified, they didn't imply, they accused. They outright claimed that she was having sex with Luke. Nancy was so shaken by the line of questioning, so humiliated by the grilling they gave her, that she stormed out of the courtroom after her testimony. If you remember, several of the men admitted to kidnapping Luke from the jail when they first were questioned by the prosecutor. But at trial, their attorney tried to walk it all back. They didn't deny what happened. They just started offering excuses, new theories, anything to create doubt, anything to confuse. First, the defense argued that the youth had only abducted Luke to run him out of town, but they didn't take his life. They then claimed that he drowned after jumping overboard as the men rowed him across the Ohio River. Then they claimed there was no evidence, no witnesses, no one who could say that they harmed Luke after taking him from the jail. After that, they argued that if a lynching did happen, it must have happened on the Kentucky side of the river, outside the county's jurisdiction. And finally, they even questioned whether the body found in the river could be identified as Luke Murray. They didn't just try to escape responsibility. They tried to erase Luke. And they had help with the theory that the body wasn't Luke's. Marshal Rip Winters, the same man who left the jail door unlocked, the same man implicated in the conspiracy to remove Luke from custody, took the stand and said that the body pulled from the river probably wasn't Luke Murray's. He said that Luke weighed about 130 pounds. And the body found in the river, he claimed weighed over 200 pounds. That was the defense's final play. Don't just deny what happened. Deny that it happened to him, that it didn't happen to Luke Murray, that Luke Murray was someplace else. After 4 days of hearing all of this, the lies and the smears and the shifting stories, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 8 hours. At first, 4 jurors held out. They wanted to convict the men of manslaughter, but the others wouldn't budge. They refused to vote to convict the men of any charge. Finally, on the 5th ballot, the jury returned their verdict. It was unanimous. Not guilty. Not guilty of doing what the men had already admitted to being a part of. Luke Murray left home in the spring of 1932. He left for work. He expected to come back and be with his family. He had no reason to think otherwise. But Jim Crow thought otherwise. Luke had committed a capital offense. He was black, he was proud, had a job, and was trusted by his white employers. That was enough to hand down his sentence. And it was also enough to ensure that his attackers weren't just protected. They were sent home with what might as well have been a community service award. Luke never saw his wife, Alberta, again. Never saw his daughter. Alberta later remarried a man named Rogers Foxworth. He took over the job of raising Luke's child, Doris, because that was stolen from Luke, along with everything else he had in life. Alberta died in 1979, and sadly, Luke's only child, Doris, died at the age of 34 in 1964. The men who took Luke's life, they continued to live, carried on, enjoyed holidays, celebrated anniversaries, saw the seasons change and the times come and go. But not Luke Murray. He didn't get that. Those men died in peace. Luke died in horror. And the law said that what they did was fine. No harm, no foul, because Luke was black. The law respected wealth and the wealthy. Always did, and in many ways still does. The Davidson family had wealth, and their wealth should have protected them and protected Luke. But there was just one problem, one hurdle. Luke was black. That canceled the wealth, removed the prestige, lowered the standard. It was like someone pulling a joker card in a card game. You had a winning hand. You thought you had it, until injustice entered the room, and the law gave way to racism, yielded to mob rule, and bowed to brutality. It put the Davidsons' wealth aside and let Jim Crow step forward. He crossed the Mason-Dixon line and came to Ohio to remind everyone that he was the law, that the law was whatever he said it was, that he ruled the day. And when it came to black people, he would always have the last say. Jim Crow may have had the last say in 1932, but today we are having our say. We are telling the truth, letting the world know that Luke Mer was here, this son, husband, father, and friend, that he was here, that he was loved, that he was somebody, that we will remember his name, his life and his story, and even his tragic death. Because as I say all the time, memory is a form of justice, and we can give Luke Mer justice by remembering him. Now, this was the last story in this series, but not the last name I have to tell you about, because there were others. Black people who weren't in court, who weren't accused of anything, who weren't even resisting, and still violence came, the threats came, the injustice came. Because when you were black, there was no hiding, no safety, no escape. And that's where we're going next. But before we do, I want to hear from you. Had you ever heard the name Luke Mer before this video? And what are your thoughts on what happened to him and how the system responded? And tell me your thoughts on this series. What stayed with you? Made you pause or reflect? Leave me a comment and let me know.